could take 10 years to get inflation under control, says Almonty Industries CEO. Now, I'm going to go into this briefly. Almonty is a tungsten mining company, and the CEO has been the CEO for 15 years. He's got some things to say, but before we do that, I actually want to go over here to a chart on macrotrends.net. This shows the inflation rate of the U.S. dollar from 1960 to 2022. You can see the annualized inflation rate of the U.S. dollar jumped significantly following 1971 with the breakup of the Bretton Woods Agreement. That is when we officially went off the gold standard on the U.S. dollar. Now, we had been moving away from the gold standard for quite some time, but it was around that time that we actually officially broke off the agreement and we went away from the gold standard. Formally. So there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. We had 6% inflation in 1970 before we went off the gold standard. So that goes to show you that going off the gold standard is not where inflation came from. We were seeing inflation before we ever went off the gold standard for a variety of reasons. Being on a gold standard is not the only thing that is going to help with inflation. It does help with money printing, but there are many other ways that governments can inflate the currency without printing money, such as screwing up supply chains and making it much harder to deliver goods and services to the populace, which causes costs of goods to go up, which impacts things like CPI data, because it's not just about the supply of the currency that impacts inflation. That's a very narrow view of what inflation is. It's actually much more than that. When we went off the gold standard, we saw 11% CPI inflation in 1974, and we saw 13.5% inflation in 1980. This was back during the era of 20% returns on bond yields, because we saw that the federal funds rate was sitting at 18, 19, 20%. The interest rates were ridiculous. I had a great uncle named Johnny who made hundreds of thousands of dollars because he had a farm, sold the farm, put a couple $1 million in bonds, and retired because they were providing 20% a year. He rode that for a while, made a ton of money. But the point I want to show you on this chart is that it looks like inflation started to go down in the 80s. That's not exactly true. What we saw happen in the 80s is CPI was redefined, and we saw that CPI started to move in a different direction. They changed the way the basket of goods was defined. I'm not going to get into all of that today, but we might make a video on CPI in the future and the corrupt history of it. The point is, inflation looked like it was sitting at 2% nominally for the last 20, 30 years. That is just ridiculous in my opinion. But the point is, in this chart, in the official history of the US dollar's inflation, the most annual change that we had ever seen in inflation was 4.88%. Well, as reported here, you can see that we were claiming inflation was 1.23% in 2020. That is absurd, because we almost doubled the supply of the U.S. dollars during that time, increased it by 40%. We also saw the entire global economy shut down, which in and of itself is going to lead to inflation. So that number is just wrong. But the point is, we are now sitting at, as is reported by the Federal Reserve, 7.5% inflation. Excuse me, I'm sorry, 7.8 to 7.9% inflation. The reason being, the three people that vote on inflation, two of them said 12%, one of them said 4%. So they averaged it out and came to 8%. Inflation is really being reported by some government entities at 12% who underreport inflation. Inflation, in my opinion, is over 20% right now. So the point I'm making here is that this is the highest jump that we've ever seen in annualized inflation. We have never seen inflation increase more in 1 year than we have this year, last year of 2021. Moving on into this year, it's only going to get worse. So when this CEO comes out and says it may take 10 years to get inflation under control, in my opinion, that's a conservative estimate. I think we are never going to get inflation under control in the way that we claim to have done in the 80s. I don't believe that we ever got inflation under control. I believe that we may have lowered it a little bit more, but we readjusted our numbers and just got used to the dollar losing as much of its value, because we think that when the entire economy grows or when the entire economy sinks relative to itself, everything's fine. That's just not true. If you try to store your value in the US dollar over a course of more than 10 years, over the course of more than 2 years nowadays, you are going to get burned. That's why Bitcoin is important. So I want to read what he actually said here. Almonty is a global mining company focused on tungsten mining and exploration. Black has over 15 years of experience in the tungsten mining industry, and here are a couple of things that he said. The fashion right now is to blame Putin, and some commodities have rallied on the back of the invasion, but some were already at all-time high or near that, or near those highs before that. He also said they have to get inflation under control. If it gets out of control, it can take you a decade. It is imperative to act now. Stop spending money and reduce the amount of money you circulate as a government. The government has been totally fine with running a 100% deficit for the last 2 years. The government, the United States federal government, if I remember correctly, I'm pulling a number off the top of my head, in 2020, I want to say it brought in $3.5 trillion in revenue from taxes and spent $6.5 trillion. Where did the other $3 trillion come from? Think about that. $3 trillion in deficit came from where? It came from debt and bond purchases and the inflation of the dollar. You did get taxed $6.5 trillion that year, just not through the levying of taxes through the IRS. You got taxed from inflation because when you inflate the US dollar, and I have 100 shares and I say, okay, well, I want more shares than 100 shares, but I don't want to go and steal their shares. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make another 100 shares and then devalue their 100 shares by half because I increased the supply by 2. That's what happened. They did bring in $6.5 trillion. There's not a deficit. It just looks like it because the makeup of the deficit is actually being funded by inflation. It's impossible to run a deficit. They can't make money out of thin air. That's not the way that works. The government never runs a deficit. All it does is that what it looks like a deficit is being funded by inflation. So the inflation of the US dollar is rampant. I don't believe it's going to take 10 years. I don't believe it's ever going to get under control. I think we're going to see major inflation forever, and the US dollar is going to come under stiff competition by Bitcoin and by the Chinese yen as we start to see the tides of geopolitics, especially globalization, which is in threat right now with the conflict in Europe, continue to shift. So Tim, what is your take on this very complicated concept? Is it going to take 10 years to get inflation under control, or are we in a vastly new paradigm where inflation might just be accepted at 15 or 20%?
I liked what you said earlier when you were like, I don't know if they've ever gotten under control. I think we just adjusted to it. That's exactly what I'm thinking. You know, people, the value of the dollar 20 years ago to now is ridiculously messed up. If you go even back 50 years, it's like I remember my dad talking about going to the store when he was a kid and getting a little Coke bottle for 5 cents, and then I think like a piece of candy for like 2 cents. You know, it's just like, wow, that you can't buy a pack of gum for that. You know, you can't even go to a
you can't buy the wrapper of a stick of gum for that.
The public restrooms sometimes cost more than that now. This is the analogy I would kind of say. We were talking about in the planning meeting this morning. When we say control, you know, they haven't controlled it, but what they've done is they've hushed people. They've gotten people to adjust to something to where it's like, all right, yes, the US dollar is not as powerful as it used to be, but I can make a lot more of it. The economy's kind of adjusted to it, and it's still an ugly system, but we've gotten used to it. And I was thinking about it. A good analogy would be when you mess up your spine and you need a chiropractor. If you've never been to a chiropractor, I was telling Smay this.
That's me right now.
I was telling Smay this the other day. There's a bliss to ignorance if you've never been to a chiropractor, because you could be walking around right now with a messed up like spine or messed up, you know, your shoulders a little wompy, you know, you're twisted a little bit, and you're not in pain. You're fine, because what happened is your body got out of alignment and then you adjusted to it and you think you're fine. What happens is the chiropractor adjusts you and fixes you, and you feel amazing, but then the smallest thing will throw you back out of whack, so you got to keep going back. In the same way, I think the US dollar has more gotten so messed up, but then we adjusted to it that people thought they were fine. So now they think we've got the US dollar under control. We have inflation under control. But in all reality, we're just a really kittywampus person who needs a chiropractor bad. And the other thing about the past that we've I talked about this on the show last week, I think, we've always just kind of stuck a pacifier in the baby's mouth and quieted them. But now there's actually a solution to the problem. The dying of the US dollar, the inflation of the US dollar, the power of every single cent that goes into the US dollar is going down, 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 down. Whereas before there was no better solution, now there's a solution, and that name is crypto. That is Bitcoin. That is these other projects in DeFi that are actually going to allow people to stop getting hurt year after year after year as the power of the dollar goes down. So I hope that analogy makes sense, because that's what I think really has happened. I don't know if there's a better way to put it. We've always just adjusted to the messed up situation, and now there's a way better solution that we can actually have good economic and good sound money coming back into our space, so where we have financial sovereignty and financial peace to not worry about it day after day.
Whoa there, partner. You watched the whole video. Good on you. Now what you can do to make me even happier is go ahead and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, bing that notification bell, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you for watching.